Prince Edward stood at the tall window of his private study, watching the morning mist roll across the palace gardens. At 38 years old, he had spent most of his life preparing to be king, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. In his hands, he held a letter that would change everything. The cream-colored paper bore his father's royal seal, and the words written inside would soon tear his family apart. The letter was addressed to Lady Isabella Hartwell, his stepmother. Edward had found it by accident 3 days ago while helping his father, King James, organize important papers. His father had been feeling weak lately, and the doctors said his heart was failing. King James had asked Edward to help sort through decades of correspondence, but Edward never expected to find this. The letter revealed a secret that had been hidden for 15 years. When Edward was 23, his beloved mother, Queen Margaret, had died in a car accident. Everyone believed it was tragic but accidental. The nation mourned with their young prince, and his father had remarried Isabella 2 years later. Isabella was beautiful, charming, and seemed to genuinely care for both the king and his son. She had become a beloved figure among the people. But this letter told a different story. Edward read it again, his hands shaking slightly. His father had written to Isabella, confessing that Queen Margaret's death was not an accident. The letter spoke of arguments between his parents, of his mother threatening to expose corruption within the royal household. It mentioned how Isabella had been working as a palace secretary at the time, and how she had access to sensitive information. The most shocking revelation was what happened the night Queen Margaret died. According to the letter, Isabella had been the one driving behind Queen Margaret's car. The letter suggested that Isabella had deliberately caused the accident, making it look like Queen Margaret had lost control on the winding country road. His father's letter was an apology to Isabella for involving her in his problems and for allowing her to take such extreme action. Edward felt sick reading these words. The woman who had raised him, who had been like a mother to him for 15 years, might have murdered his real mother. His father, the man he respected above all others, had covered up this terrible crime. And now, King James was dying, taking this secret with him to the grave. The palace was quiet this early in the morning. Edward could hear the distant sounds of servants beginning their daily work. Soon, the corridors would be filled with activity. Ministers would arrive for meetings, staff would prepare for the day's events, and journalists would gather outside hoping for news about the king's health. But for now, Edward was alone with this terrible knowledge. He thought about Isabella, who was probably having breakfast in her private dining room. She had been acting normally lately, showing concern for her husband's illness and supporting Edward as he prepared to take on more royal duties. She had even helped plan several charity events for the coming months. To the outside world, she appeared to be a devoted wife and caring stepmother. Edward remembered how Isabella had comforted him when he was young and struggling with his mother's death. She had held him while he cried, helped him with his studies, and encouraged him to honor his mother's memory by becoming the best king he could be. She had attended every important moment in his life, from his university graduation to his military ceremonies. She had been there when he met Lady Catherine, his fiancée, and had helped plan their upcoming wedding. But now Edward wondered if it had all been an act. Had Isabella been feeling guilty all these years? Had her kindness been a way to make up for what she had done? Or had she truly cared for him while hiding this dark secret? The engagement to Lady Catherine was supposed to be announced publicly next month. Catherine came from a noble family and had been Edward's close friend since childhood. Their families had hoped they would marry someday, and over the past 2 years, friendship had grown into love. Catherine was intelligent, compassionate, and understood the duties that came with royal life. She would make an excellent queen. But how could Edward marry Catherine while carrying this secret? How could he become king knowing what he knew about his family? The crown was supposed to represent honor, justice, and moral leadership. How could he wear it when his family was built on lies and murder? Edward walked to his desk and sat down heavily in the leather chair. The letter lay before him like a poisonous snake. He had 3 choices, and none of them were good. He could confront his father, demanding the truth and possibly causing the sick man to have a heart attack. He could confront Isabella, risking her denying everything and destroying their family. Or he could stay silent, becoming an accomplice to his mother's murder. There was also the question of what to do about the kingdom. The people loved Isabella. She had done important charity work, supporting education and healthcare programs. She had represented the royal family with dignity at international events. If this scandal came out, It would destroy not just her, but the entire monarchy. The country had already survived several political crises in recent years. This might be the final blow that ended the royal system altogether. Edward thought about his mother, Queen Margaret. She had been a strong, principled woman who believed in doing what was right, even when it was difficult. She had spoken out against corruption and had demanded transparency in government. If she were alive, what would she want him to do? Would she want him to expose the truth no matter the consequences? Or would she want him to protect the institution of the monarchy, even if it meant letting her murderer go free? The morning sun was getting stronger, filling the study with golden light. Edward could hear voices in the hallway now. The palace was waking up, and soon someone would come looking for him. He had official duties to perform today. There was a meeting with the Prime Minister about trade agreements, a ceremony honoring military veterans, and a dinner with foreign ambassadors. Everyone would be watching him, looking for signs of how he was handling his father's illness and his increasing responsibilities. Edward folded the letter and put it in his jacket pocket. He couldn't make this decision alone. He needed time to think, and he needed advice from someone he could trust. But who could he tell? His private secretary, Sir Robert, had served the royal family for 20 years, but he was also loyal to Isabella. His best friend from university, Thomas, wasn't involved in royal matters and might not understand the political implications. Then Edward thought of his aunt, Princess Charlotte. She was his father's sister and had always been close to his mother. Charlotte was in her 60s now and had spent her life serving the royal family without ever seeking the spotlight. She was known for her wisdom and honesty. More importantly, she had never liked Isabella and had always thought the marriage happened too quickly after Queen Margaret's death. Edward decided he would visit Princess Charlotte that evening. Her estate was only an hour's drive from the palace, and he could make the trip without arousing suspicion. He often visited his aunt, especially during stressful times. She had been a source of comfort and guidance throughout his life. As Edward prepared to leave his study and begin his official duties, he took one last look at the gardens where his mother used to walk. Queen Margaret had loved roses, and Isabella had kept the rose garden beautiful in her memory. Now Edward wondered if that was guilt or genuine respect. Had Isabella been tormented by what she had done, or had she simply moved on with her life? The next few hours passed in a blur of meetings and ceremonies. Edward played his role perfectly, smiling and speaking confidently about the future of the kingdom. No one suspected that his world had been turned upside down. He shook hands with ministers, listened to briefings about economic policy, and gave a speech about the importance of supporting veterans. During lunch with the foreign ambassadors, Isabella joined them. She looked elegant in a navy blue dress and pearl necklace, and she charmed the guests with her knowledge of their countries and cultures. Edward watched her carefully, looking for any signs of the guilt or deception he now suspected. But Isabella seemed completely at ease, discussing art and literature with the ambassador from France and asking thoughtful questions about education policy in Germany. After the ambassadors left, Isabella approached Edward in the reception hall. "You seem tired today, dear," she said with concern. "Are you sleeping well? I know your father's illness is weighing on you." Edward looked into her eyes, searching for any hint of the truth. "I'm fine," he said, "just trying to balance everything." Isabella placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Your mother would be so proud of you," she said softly. "You're handling these responsibilities with such grace and maturity." The mention of his mother made Edward's stomach clench. "Thank you," he managed to say. "I know it's difficult, preparing to lose a parent," Isabella continued. "When I lost my own mother, I thought the pain would never end. But having your father and you in my life has helped heal those wounds. We built something beautiful together, our family." Edward nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Isabella's words sounded sincere, but now he couldn't tell what was real and what was performance. That evening, Edward drove to Princess Charlotte's estate as planned. The country roads were peaceful, lined with oak trees that were beginning to show their autumn colors. As he drove, Edward tried to organize his thoughts. How would he tell Charlotte about the letter? How would she react to learning that her beloved sister-in-law might have been murdered? Princess Charlotte lived in a smaller palace that had been in the royal family for generations. Unlike the main palace where Edward lived, this place felt more like a home than an official residence. Charlotte had decorated it with comfortable furniture, family photographs, and artwork collected during her travels around the world. Charlotte greeted Edward at the door with a warm hug. She was a petite woman with silver hair and bright blue eyes that reminded Edward of his mother. "What a lovely surprise," she said. "I was just having tea in the garden. Join me." They sat at a small table surrounded by chrysanthemums and late-blooming roses. Charlotte poured tea from a delicate china pot and offered Edward small cakes that her cook had made. For a few minutes, they talked about ordinary things. Charlotte asked about Edward's engagement preparations and his father's health. She mentioned a book she was reading and a charity project she was supporting. Finally, Edward couldn't wait any longer. "Aunt Charlotte," he said, "I need to tell you something important. Something that might change everything." Charlotte set down her teacup and looked at him seriously. "What is it, dear?" Edward pulled the letter from his pocket and handed it to her. "I found this among Father's papers. I think you should read it." Charlotte put on her reading glasses and began to read. Edward watched her face carefully as her expression changed from curiosity to shock to horror. Her hands began to tremble, and she had to set the letter down on the table. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Oh my dear Margaret." "Is it possible?" Edward asked. Could this be true? Charlotte was quiet for a long moment, staring at the letter. Then she looked up at Edward with tears in her eyes. "I always wondered," she said quietly. The timing was so convenient for Isabella. She went from being a palace secretary to being queen in just 2 years. "But did you suspect this?" "I suspected Isabella had feelings for your father before your mother died," Charlotte said. "I saw the way she looked at him, the way she always found excuses to be near him. But murder? I never imagined she would go that far." Charlotte picked up the letter again and read it more carefully. Your father's handwriting, his personal seal, the details he mentions about that night, this appears to be genuine. Edward felt a cold weight settling in his chest. Part of him had hoped Charlotte would tell him the letter was fake or that his father was confused by his illness, but she believed it was real. "What should I do?" Edward asked. Charlotte looked at him with compassion and sadness. "That's not a decision I can make for you, but I can tell you what your mother would have wanted." "What?" Margaret believed in truth above everything else. She thought that secrets and lies were poison that eventually destroyed everything they touched. She would want the truth to come out, no matter how painful. "But it could destroy the monarchy," Edward said. "The people trust us to be better than this. The people deserve leaders who are honest," Charlotte replied. "If we built our throne on lies, then maybe it doesn't deserve to survive." As Edward drove back to the palace late that night, he knew what he had to do. The truth was more important than protecting Isabella or even protecting the crown. His mother had died for standing up for what was right, and he couldn't dishonor her memory by staying silent. But first, he would give Isabella a chance to confess. He would confront her privately and see if she was capable of telling the truth after all these years. If she denied it, he would have to decide whether to make the letter public or handle it quietly within the family. Either way, Edward knew that by tomorrow night, everything would be different. The woman he had called mother for 15 years would be revealed as his mother's killer. His father would die knowing his darkest secret had been discovered, and Edward would have to find a way to rebuild his family and his kingdom from the ashes of this terrible truth. Edward barely slept that night. He lay in his enormous bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how he would confront Isabella. The palace was silent except for the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Every hour that chimed reminded him that time was running out. His father was growing weaker each day, and Edward couldn't let King James die without knowing that the truth had been discovered. The next morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching Edward's mood. He dressed carefully in a dark suit and straightened his tie multiple times in the mirror. He looked like a prince preparing for official duties, but inside he felt like a young man about to destroy his family. His hands shook slightly as he combed his hair, and he had to take several deep breaths to calm himself. Edward had decided to meet Isabella in the blue drawing room, a formal but private space where they wouldn't be interrupted. He sent a message through his private secretary, asking Isabella to meet him there at 10 o'clock to discuss wedding preparations. It was a believable excuse that wouldn't raise suspicions among the palace staff. At exactly 10 o'clock, Edward stood by the tall windows of the blue drawing room, looking out at the palace gardens. The roses his mother had loved were still blooming, their red petals bright against the gray morning. When Isabella knocked and entered, Edward turned to face her. Isabella looked beautiful as always, wearing a cream-colored dress with a string of pearls. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, and her makeup was flawless. She smiled warmly at Edward as she approached. "Good morning, dear. I'm so glad you wanted to discuss the wedding plans. Catherine will make such a lovely bride. Please sit down," Edward said, gesturing to one of the blue silk chairs. Isabella sat gracefully, smoothing her dress. "I've been thinking about the flowers for the ceremony," she began. "Perhaps we could include some roses in honor of your mother. I know how much she loved them." The mention of his mother made Edward's chest tighten. "We need to talk about something else," he said quietly. Something in his tone must have warned Isabella because her smile faded slightly. "What is it? You look upset." Edward reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the letter. Isabella's eyes immediately focused on the cream-colored paper with the royal seal. Her face went completely pale, and Edward knew without a doubt that she recognized it. "Where did you find that?" Isabella whispered. "Among Father's papers," Edward replied. "He asked me to help organize his correspondence." Isabella's hands began to tremble. She reached out as if to take the letter, then pulled her hands back to her lap. "Edward, I can explain. Can you?" Edward asked. "Can you explain how my mother really died?" Isabella closed her eyes and was quiet for a long moment. When she opened them again, tears were beginning to form. "I never wanted you to know," she said softly. "It would only cause you pain. So it's true?" Edward's voice was barely above a whisper. Isabella nodded slowly. "But it's not what you think. It wasn't murder, Edward. It was an accident." "Tell me what happened that night," Edward demanded. Isabella stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens. "Your mother was very unhappy in her marriage," she began. "She and your father had been having terrible arguments for months. She threatened to leave him and take you with her. She said she would expose corruption in the government and destroy the monarchy." Edward felt angry hearing Isabella talk about his mother this way. "That doesn't justify killing her." "I didn't kill her," Isabella said firmly, turning to face him. "I was driving behind her that night because your father asked me to follow her. Margaret had been drinking at dinner, and she was extremely upset. Your father was worried she might hurt herself. And then what happened?" Isabella's tears were flowing freely now. "Margaret was driving too fast on those winding roads. I was trying to keep up with her, but it was raining and the roads were slippery. When we came to that sharp curve near the bridge, she lost control. Her car went off the road and hit the tree. But Father's letter suggests you caused the accident." Isabella shook her head. "I got out of my car immediately and ran to help her. But she was already gone. The impact was too severe. I was holding her hand when she died, Edward. I tried to save her." Edward studied Isabella's face, trying to determine if she was telling the truth. "Then why does Father's letter apologize for involving you? Why does it suggest you took extreme action?" Isabella wiped her tears with a handkerchief. "Because I helped cover up the circumstances. We told the police that Margaret was driving alone, that no one else was there. Your father was afraid that if people knew they had been fighting and that Margaret was drinking, it would cause a scandal. He was thinking about protecting you and protecting the monarchy. So you lied to the police?" "Yes," Isabella admitted. "I lied to protect your family's reputation. I stayed silent about the arguments between your parents and about Margaret's drinking problem. The letter is your father's way of thanking me for that silence and apologizing for putting me in that position." Edward felt confused and overwhelmed. This version of events was very different from what he had imagined after reading the letter. "But you benefited from Mother's death. You married Father and became queen." Isabella's face showed pain at these words. "I loved your father long before your mother died," she said. "But I never acted on those feelings while she was alive. After the accident, James was devastated. He needed support, and I was there for him. Over time, that support grew into something deeper. Did you want Mother to die so you could have Father? No," Isabella said firmly. "I would never wish death on anyone, especially not Margaret. She was a complicated woman, but she was your mother and James's wife. I respected that, even when their marriage was falling apart." Edward sat down heavily in one of the chairs. His mind was spinning with this new information. "How do I know you're telling me the truth now?" Isabella returned to her chair and leaned forward earnestly. Because I love you like my own son, Edward. I have loved you for 15 years. I would never hurt you by lying about something this important. But you've been lying for 15 years about what happened that night. I kept a secret to protect the family, Isabella corrected. Your father asked me to, and I thought it was the right thing to do. You were so young and already traumatized by losing your mother. Learning that she had been drinking and fighting with your father would have made the pain worse. Edward thought about this. It was true that he had idealized his mother's memory. Learning that his parents' marriage had been troubled would be difficult to accept. What exactly were they fighting about? Isabella hesitated. Are you sure you want to know? Some things are better left in the past. I need to know everything. Isabella sighed. Your mother had discovered that several government ministers were taking bribes from foreign companies. She wanted your father to expose them publicly, even though it would have caused a major political crisis. Your father thought it would be better to handle the situation quietly, forcing the corrupt ministers to resign without creating a scandal. So mother was trying to do the right thing, yes, but in a way that would have damaged the country's stability. Your father was trying to achieve the same goal while protecting the nation from chaos. They both had good intentions, but they couldn't agree on the method. Edward remembered his mother's strong sense of justice. It made sense that she would want to expose corruption publicly, regardless of the consequences. What happened to those ministers? Your father quietly forced them to resign over the following months. The corruption was stopped, but without the public scandal that would have accompanied Margaret's approach. And the foreign companies? They were banned from doing business with the government. Justice was served, just not in the dramatic way your mother had wanted. Edward felt some relief knowing that the corruption had been dealt with, even if quietly. But he was still struggling with the revelation about his parents' troubled marriage. Were they going to divorce? Isabella nodded sadly. Margaret had started talking to lawyers. She wanted to take you and leave the country. She felt that James was too willing to compromise his principles for political convenience. And father let her drive that night knowing she was upset and had been drinking? He tried to stop her, but Margaret was determined to leave. She said she was going to her sister's house to think about their future. James asked me to follow her because he was worried about her safety. Edward understood now why his father had felt guilty all these years. Even if Isabella hadn't caused the accident, King James had failed to protect his wife when she was vulnerable and upset. The guilt had eaten away at him for 15 years. Why are you telling me this now? Edward asked. You could have continued to deny everything. Because you deserve the truth, Isabella replied, and because I'm tired of carrying this secret. Your father is dying, and I don't want to spend whatever time we have left continuing this deception. Edward looked at Isabella with new eyes. She no longer seemed like the stepmother he had known for 15 years. She was revealed as a woman who had loved a married man, witnessed a tragedy, and then built her life on a foundation of secrets. But he also saw someone who genuinely seemed to care about him and his father. What happens now? Edward asked. That's up to you, Isabella said. You could expose everything and let the public decide what to think. Or you could choose to let the past stay in the past. What about your conscience? Don't you feel guilty about lying all these years? Isabella was quiet for a moment. Every day, she finally said. But I've tried to make up for it by being the best wife and stepmother I could be. I've tried to honor Margaret's memory by supporting the causes she cared about. Edward thought about all the charity work Isabella had done over the years. She had focused on education and children's welfare, causes that had been important to his mother. At the time, he had thought it was a nice gesture. Now he wondered if it had been motivated by guilt. Does father know you're telling me this? No. He still thinks the letter is safely hidden among his papers. I haven't told him you found it. Edward realized he would have to decide whether to tell his dying father that their secret had been discovered. It seemed cruel to burden a sick man with this knowledge, but it also seemed wrong to let him die thinking the truth was still hidden. I need time to think about all this, Edward said. Isabella nodded. Of course. This is a lot to process. As Isabella prepared to leave, she turned back to Edward. I want you to know that everything I've done since that night has been motivated by love. Love for your father and love for you. I know that doesn't excuse the lies, but I hope it explains them. After Isabella left, Edward remained in the blue drawing room for a long time. The rain had stopped, and pale sunlight was beginning to break through the clouds. He watched the gardeners working among the roses, maintaining the beauty that had been his mother's legacy. Edward realized that the truth was more complicated than he had initially thought. Isabella might not be the cold-blooded murderer he had imagined, but she was still someone who had built her life on deception. His father was not the completely honorable man Edward had believed him to be, but neither was he the monster the letter had suggested. His mother emerged as a more complex figure too. She had been fighting for justice, but her methods might have caused great harm to the country. She had been struggling with personal demons, including drinking and an unhappy marriage. She was still the principled woman Edward remembered, but she was also flawed and human. The question now was what Edward should do with this knowledge. He could expose everything and let the public judge his family. This would likely destroy Isabella's reputation and tarnish his father's legacy, but it would also be honest and transparent. Alternatively, he could choose to keep the secret, becoming complicit in the cover-up, but protecting his family from scandal. Edward thought about his upcoming marriage to Catherine. How could he start his new life carrying this burden? Catherine deserved to know the truth about the family she was marrying into, but telling her would mean involving another person in the secret and potentially putting her in a difficult position. There was also the question of what his mother would have wanted. Based on what Charlotte had said, Queen Margaret would have wanted the truth to come out, but this new version of events suggested that Margaret herself had been keeping secrets about the corruption she had discovered. Maybe she would have understood the value of protecting the family and the monarchy. As Edward finally left the blue drawing room, he realized that he needed more information before making his decision. He wanted to speak with the police officers who had investigated his mother's accident. He wanted to see if there were any other documents or witnesses that could help him understand what really happened that night. Most importantly, he needed to talk to his father. King James was the only person who knew the complete truth about that night and about the years that followed. Even if it was painful, Edward needed to hear his father's version of events before deciding how to proceed. The weight of the secret felt different now than it had the day before. It was still heavy and troubling, but it no longer felt like a simple matter of good and evil. Instead, it felt like a complicated story of human weakness, difficult choices, and unintended consequences. Edward was beginning to understand that being king would mean dealing with exactly these kinds of moral ambiguities. As he prepared for his afternoon duties, Edward made a mental note to visit his father that evening. The conversation would be difficult, but it was necessary. Only by understanding the full truth could Edward make the right decision about his family's future and his own path to the throne. That evening, Edward walked slowly through the palace corridors toward his father's private chambers. The ornate hallways that had once seemed majestic now felt oppressive, filled with portraits of ancestors who seemed to watch him with judging eyes. Each step echoed on the marble floors, and Edward felt the weight of generations of royal tradition pressing down on him. King James was resting in his study, a comfortable room lined with leather-bound books and family photographs. Despite his illness, the king still insisted on working several hours each day, reviewing government documents and meeting with advisors. Edward found him sitting in his favorite armchair reading a briefing paper about trade negotiations. The king looked frail and tired, but his mind remained sharp. "Edward," King James smiled when he saw his son enter. "Come in, sit with me. I was just reading about the proposed treaty with Denmark. What do you think about the agricultural provisions?" Edward sat in the chair across from his father, but he couldn't focus on trade agreements. "Father, I need to talk to you about something personal." King James set down his papers and looked at his son with concern. "You seem troubled. Is everything all right with Catherine, the wedding preparations?" Edward pulled the letter from his pocket and placed it on the small table between them. King James stared at it for a moment, and the color drained from his face. He reached for the letter with a shaking hand. "Where did you find this?" the king whispered. "Among the papers you asked me to organize," Edward replied quietly. King James closed his eyes and leaned back in his chair. For a moment, Edward worried that the shock might cause his father to collapse. But when the king opened his eyes again, they were filled with a mixture of relief and sadness. "I've been waiting 15 years for this day," King James said. "I always knew someone would eventually discover the truth." "Is it true?" Edward asked. Did Isabella kill mother? King James was quiet for a long time, staring at the letter in his hands. Finally, he looked up at his son. No, he said firmly. Isabella didn't kill your mother, but I did. Edward felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath him. What do you mean? I mean that I failed to protect Margaret when she needed me most, King James explained. I let her drive away that night knowing she was upset and had been drinking. I should have physically stopped her, taken her car keys, done whatever was necessary to keep her safe. Instead, I let my pride and anger cloud my judgment. But the letter suggests that Isabella took extreme action. The extreme action was helping me cover up the circumstances of Margaret's death, King James said. Isabella witnessed the accident, and she helped me lie to the police about what happened. We told them Margaret was driving alone, that there had been no argument, that she hadn't been drinking. Edward felt confused. That's exactly what Isabella told me this morning. King James looked surprised. You spoke to her about this? I confronted her with the letter. She explained everything, but I wasn't sure whether to believe her. What exactly did she tell you? Edward recounted his conversation with Isabella, including her explanation about following his mother on his father's request, and her description of the accident. King James listened carefully, occasionally nodding. She told you the truth, the king said when Edward finished. Every word of it. Then why did you write that letter? It makes it sound like Isabella murdered mother. King James rubbed his forehead tiredly. Because I was consumed with guilt and not thinking clearly. When I wrote that letter 5 years ago, I was trying to apologize to Isabella for involving her in our family's tragedy. But I used poor language that made it sound worse than it was. 5 years ago? Why then? It was the 10th anniversary of your mother's death, and I was feeling particularly guilty. Isabella had been such a wonderful wife and mother to you, but I knew she was haunted by that night. She often had nightmares about the accident. I wanted to acknowledge her sacrifice and thank her for keeping our family's secrets. Edward tried to process this information. So mother really did die in an accident? Yes, but it was an accident that I could have prevented. Margaret was deeply troubled during the last months of her life. She was drinking more than usual, and she was under enormous stress because of the corruption she had discovered in the government. Isabella told me about the corrupt ministers. Your mother wanted to expose them immediately, regardless of the political consequences. I wanted to handle the situation more quietly. We had terrible arguments about it. The night she died, we had our worst fight yet. King James stood up slowly and walked to the window overlooking the gardens. Margaret threatened to leave me and take you with her. She said I was a coward who cared more about political stability than justice. I was angry and told her she was being naive and reckless. She stormed out, saying she was going to her sister's house to think about filing for divorce. And you asked Isabella to follow her? Yes. Isabella was working late that night, organizing some correspondence for me. When Margaret left, I was worried about her safety. She had been drinking wine during dinner, and she was extremely emotional. I asked Isabella to take another car and follow Margaret to make sure she arrived safely at her sister's house. Edward could see the pain in his father's face as he recounted these memories. What happened then? Isabella called me from her car phone about 20 minutes later. She was crying and could barely speak. She said there had been an accident, that Margaret's car had gone off the road. By the time I arrived at the scene, the ambulance was already there, but it was too late. And you decided to lie about the circumstances? King James turned back to face his son. I was devastated and not thinking rationally. When the police arrived, they asked about Margaret's state of mind and whether she had been drinking. I panicked, thinking about how it would look if the truth came out. A queen driving while intoxicated after a fight with her husband about government corruption. The scandal would have destroyed the monarchy. So you and Isabella told the mother was driving alone? Isabella didn't want to lie, but I convinced her it was necessary to protect you and protect the institution. We said Margaret had gone out for a quiet drive alone, that there had been no argument, no drinking, no problems in the marriage. Edward sat quietly, trying to understand his father's decision. Did you ever regret the cover-up? Every single day, King James said emphatically, the guilt has eaten away at me for 15 years. I failed your mother twice. First by letting her drive away angry and intoxicated, and then by lying about the circumstances of her death. What about Isabella? How has she lived with this secret? It's been very difficult for her, the king admitted. She truly loved Margaret as a friend before the accident. Afterwards, she felt guilty for benefiting from Margaret's death by eventually marrying me. She spent 15 years trying to honor your mother's memory through charity work and by being a loving stepmother to you. Edward thought about all the times Isabella had seemed sad or distant, especially on the anniversary of his mother's death. He had always attributed it to natural grief, but now he understood it was more complicated. "Father, I need to ask you something difficult," Edward said. "Did you love Mother when she died, or had you already fallen in love with Isabella?" King James considered this question carefully. "I loved your mother, but our marriage had become very strained. We disagreed about almost everything, from how to raise you to how to handle government business. I had developed feelings for Isabella, but I never acted on them while married to Margaret. And after Mother died, Isabella was the only person who truly understood what I was going through. She had witnessed the accident and shared the burden of keeping our secrets. Over time, my gratitude and friendship with her grew into love, but it took 2 years before I could even consider remarriage." Edward understood now why the situation had been so complicated. His father hadn't been a villain who plotted his wife's death, but he hadn't been an innocent victim either. He had been a flawed man who made poor decisions during a crisis and then spent years living with the consequences. "Do you think Mother would forgive you if she were alive today?" King James smiled sadly. "Your mother was a complicated woman, Edward. She had a fierce temper and could hold grudges, but she also had enormous capacity for forgiveness. I think she would understand that I was trying to protect our family, even if she disagreed with my methods." "What about the corruption she was trying to expose? You said those ministers were forced to resign?" "Yes. Within 6 months of Margaret's death, all the corrupt officials were quietly removed from their positions. The companies involved were banned from government contracts. Justice was served, just not in the public way Margaret had wanted." Edward felt some relief knowing that his mother's fight against corruption had ultimately succeeded. "Why didn't you ever tell me any of this before?" "Because you idolized your mother's memory, and I didn't want to tarnish it by revealing her struggles with alcohol and our marital problems. I also didn't want to burden you with the knowledge of how badly I had failed her. But now I know everything." "Yes, and now you have to decide what to do with this knowledge," King James said seriously. "You could expose everything and let the public judge our family. Or you could choose to keep these secrets, as Isabella and I have done for 15 years. Edward looked at his dying father, seeing him clearly for the first time. King James wasn't the perfect, honorable man Edward had always believed him to be, but he also wasn't evil. He was human, with all the weaknesses and failures that humanity entailed. "What would you do if you were in my position?" Edward asked. "I can't make that decision for you," King James replied, "but I can tell you what I've learned from carrying this burden for 15 years. Secrets are like poison. They corrupt everything they touch. Your mother died partly because we were keeping secrets about government corruption. I've spent 15 years keeping secrets about her death. Maybe it's time for the truth to finally come out, even if it destroys Isabella and damages the monarchy." "Isabella is stronger than you think. She's been carrying this guilt for 15 years, and part of her would be relieved to finally be free of it. As for the monarchy, if it can't survive the truth about our human failures, then perhaps it doesn't deserve to survive." Edward was surprised by his father's words. "I thought you would want me to protect the institution at all costs." "I used to think that way," King James said. "But years of living with lies have taught me that truth is more important than tradition. Your mother understood that. It's one of the reasons she was willing to expose government corruption, even if it caused a political crisis." "So you think I should tell the truth publicly?" "I think you should do whatever will allow you to live with yourself."
If you can carry these secrets without becoming bitter and cynical, then perhaps keeping them is the right choice.
"But if the weight of them will poison your relationships and your reign, then perhaps exposure is the better option." As Edward prepared to leave his father's chambers, King James called him back. "There's something else you should know," the king said. "I've already spoken to my doctors about my condition. I have perhaps 2 weeks left, maybe less." Edward felt his heart break at this news. Despite everything he had learned, he still loved his father deeply. "Father, I'm so sorry." "Don't be sorry for me," King James said. "I've had a good life. and I've had the privilege of watching you grow into the kind of man who will make an excellent king. I'm only sorry that you're inheriting such a complicated legacy. What should I tell Isabella about our conversation? Tell her the truth. She deserves to know that her secrets are no longer secret. And Edward, King James paused. Whatever you decide about exposing our family's history, please remember that Isabella loves you genuinely. Her feelings for you have never been tainted by the circumstances that brought her into our family. That night, Edward walked through the palace gardens where his mother had once tended her roses. The moon was full, casting silver light on the flower beds that Isabella had maintained for 15 years. Edward tried to imagine what his life would have been like if his mother had lived, if his parents had divorced, if the truth about that night had come out immediately. But he couldn't change the past. He could only decide what to do with the knowledge he now possessed. Tomorrow, he would need to tell Isabella about his conversation with his father. He would need to consider whether to tell Catherine the truth before their wedding. And soon, he would need to decide whether to expose his family's secrets to the world or take them with him to the throne. The weight of these decisions felt enormous, but Edward realized that this was what being king really meant. It wasn't just about ceremonies and ribbon cuttings. It was about making impossible choices and living with the consequences. His parents had failed at this test, allowing secrets and lies to poison their marriage and ultimately contribute to his mother's death. Edward was determined to do better. Whatever he decided about the past, he would build his future reign on honesty and transparency. The question was whether that future included exposing his family's darkest secrets or finding a way to honor the truth while protecting the people he loved. The next morning brought urgent news that changed everything. Edward was awakened at dawn by his private secretary, Sir Robert, who looked pale and distressed. King James had suffered a massive heart attack during the night and was not expected to survive more than a few hours. Edward rushed to his father's bedside, where Isabella was already keeping vigil. She sat in a chair beside the king's bed, holding his hand while tears streamed down her face. The royal physician, Dr. Harrison, stood nearby with a grave expression. "How long does he have?" Edward asked quietly. "Hours at most," Dr. Harrison replied. "His heart is failing rapidly. We're keeping him comfortable, but there's nothing more we can do medically." Edward sat on the other side of the bed and took his father's other hand. King James's breathing was labored, but his eyes were still alert and focused. When he saw Edward, he managed a weak smile. "Son," he whispered, "I'm glad you're here. Don't try to talk, father. Save your strength." But King James shook his head slightly. "I need to say something important." He looked at Isabella, then back at Edward. "Did you tell her about our conversation?" Edward glanced at Isabella, who looked confused. "Not yet, father. Tell her now," King James said with great effort. "She needs to know." Edward felt awkward having this conversation at his father's deathbed, but he couldn't refuse the dying man's request. He looked at Isabella and said gently, "I spoke with father last night about the letter, about what really happened the night mother died." Isabella's face went white. "What did he tell you?" "The same thing you did, that it was an accident, that you helped cover up the circumstances to protect the family." Isabella looked relieved but also worried. "And what will you do with this knowledge?" Before Edward could answer, King James spoke again, his voice barely audible. But I also told him that secrets are poison, that your mother would have wanted the truth." Isabella began crying again. "James, I'm so sorry. I should never have agreed to lie about that night." "You were protecting us," the king whispered. "You always put our family first, but maybe it's time for the truth." Dr. Harrison stepped forward. "Your Majesty, you shouldn't strain yourself with conversation." But King James ignored the doctor's advice. "Edward, come closer." Edward leaned down so his father could whisper in his ear. "In my private safe," King James said, "there are documents about the government corruption, evidence your mother gathered. Maybe her work shouldn't die with our secrets. Where is the safe?" "Behind the portrait of my grandfather." "Combination is your mother's birthday." King James paused, struggling to breathe. "Give your mother's work the recognition she deserved." These were among the last coherent words King James spoke. Over the next few hours, Edward and Isabella sat beside him as his condition deteriorated. Occasionally, the king would squeeze their hands or open his eyes briefly, but he was mostly unconscious. As the afternoon wore on, other family members arrived to say goodbye. Princess Charlotte came and spent an hour sitting with her brother, sharing quiet memories of their childhood. Catherine arrived and comforted Edward, though she could sense there was more troubling him than just his father's impending death. At sunset, with Edward holding one hand and Isabella holding the other, King James took his final breath. After 43 years on the throne and a lifetime of service to his country, the king was gone. Edward felt an overwhelming mixture of grief, love, and regret. There had been so much left unsaid between them, so many years when Edward had not truly known who his father was. In the immediate aftermath of the king's death, Edward had little time to process his emotions. There were protocols to follow, announcements to make, and arrangements to coordinate. Within hours, the palace was transformed from a quiet sick room into a center of intense activity. The Prime Minister arrived to officially recognize Edward as the new king. Television crews gathered outside the palace gates. Foreign dignitaries began calling to offer condolences and confirm their attendance at the funeral. Isabella, despite her own grief, helped coordinate many of these arrangements while Edward met with government officials. That evening, after the initial chaos had subsided, Edward finally had a chance to visit his father's private safe. Using the combination of his mother's birthday, he opened the heavy door and found several folders of documents. As he read through them, he realized that his mother had been building a comprehensive case against the corrupt government ministers. The evidence was damning and detailed. Queen Margaret had documented illegal payments, foreign bribes, and violations of public trust that went far beyond what Edward had previously understood. She had been preparing to present this evidence to Parliament when she died. Her death had not only ended her life, but had also buried this important work. Edward sat in his father's study, surrounded by his mother's research, and realized that he now faced an even more complex decision. It wasn't just about whether to reveal the circumstances of his mother's death. It was about whether to finish the work she had started, work that had cost her marriage and potentially her life. The next few days passed in a blur of funeral preparations and meetings with government officials. Edward was briefed on state secrets, introduced to intelligence chiefs, and given access to information that only the monarch could know. The weight of kingship settled on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. Throughout this period, Isabella was a constant source of support. She helped with ceremonial arrangements, coordinated with foreign royal families, and managed the household staff who were struggling with their own grief. Edward watched her work and realized how much the palace had depended on her expertise over the years. But he also noticed that Isabella seemed different. The secret they had shared for so long was now known, and she appeared both relieved and worried about what Edward might do with the information. She was kind and supportive as always, but there was a tension in her manner that hadn't been there before. 3 days before the funeral, Edward decided he needed to have a serious conversation with Isabella about their future. He invited her to join him for dinner in his private dining room, where they could talk without interruption. "How are you holding up?" Edward asked as they sat down to a simple meal of soup and sandwiches. "I'm managing," Isabella replied. "The funeral arrangements are nearly complete, and I think James would be pleased with the ceremony we've planned." "I'm not talking about the funeral arrangements," Edward said gently. "I'm asking how you're coping with everything that's happened, everything we've discussed." Isabella set down her spoon and looked at Edward seriously. "I feel relieved that you finally know the truth, but I'm also terrified about what comes next. I've been your stepmother for 15 years, but now I don't know what my role is supposed to be." "What do you mean?" "I mean that you're the king now, and you have every right to decide whether you want me to remain part of the royal family. If you choose to expose what happened 15 years ago, I understand that my position here would become impossible." Edward hadn't considered this aspect of the situation. As king, he did have the power to effectively exile Isabella from the royal family, and exposure of her role in covering up the circumstances of his mother's death would likely force her to resign from public life. "Is that what you think I should do?" Edward asked. Isabella considered this question carefully. "I think you should do whatever will help you be the best king possible. If keeping family secrets will weigh on your conscience and affect your ability to lead, then perhaps exposure is the right choice. If you can find a way to honor your mother's memory while moving forward, then perhaps the past can remain in the past. What about your own preferences? What would you choose if the decision were yours? Honestly? Isabella paused. Part of me would be relieved if the truth came out. I'm tired of carrying this burden, tired of wondering when someone might discover what really happened. But I'm also afraid of the pain it would cause to people I care about. Like who? Like you. Like Catherine, who would be marrying into a family surrounded by scandal. Like your father's legacy, which would be forever tainted by his failures on that night 15 years ago. Edward understood her concerns, but he was also thinking about the evidence he had found in his father's safe. Isabella, there's something else I need to tell you. Father left behind all of Mother's research on the government corruption. Her evidence could still be used to bring justice to those responsible. Isabella looked surprised. After all these years? Some of the people involved are still in government, still in positions where they could do harm. Mother's work could prevent future corruption and honor her commitment to justice. But using that evidence would require explaining how you obtained it, which would lead to questions about Margaret's state of mind when she died. Edward nodded. That's exactly the dilemma. To finish Mother's work, I might have to reveal the circumstances of her death. They sat in thoughtful silence for several minutes. Finally, Isabella spoke. Edward, I want to tell you something I've never told anyone, not even your father. What is it? The night Margaret died, just before the accident. She called me on the car phone. She was crying and said she wanted to apologize for some of the harsh things she had said to James. She asked me to tell him that she loved him despite their problems. Edward felt his eyes filling with tears. She said that? Yes. She also said she was proud of you and wanted you to know that everything she was fighting for was to make sure you inherited a kingdom worth ruling. Why didn't you ever tell Father this? Because he was already consumed with guilt about letting her drive away angry. I thought it would be more painful for him to know that she was trying to reconcile when she died. Edward realized that this information changed his understanding of his mother's final moments. She hadn't died angry and bitter, planning to destroy the monarchy. She had died while trying to repair her marriage and thinking about her son's future. Isabella, Edward said slowly, I've made my decision about what to do with our family's secrets. Isabella looked at him with a mixture of hope and fear. What have you decided? I'm going to tell the truth, but not all at once and not in a way that destroys everyone involved. What does that mean? Edward explained his plan. First, he would privately approach the government officials who had been involved in the corruption his mother had discovered. He would give them a chance to resign quietly and make restitution for their actions. If they refused, he would make the evidence public. Second, he would work with journalists and historians to gradually reveal the true story of his mother's death, focusing on her important anti-corruption work rather than the personal details of her marriage problems. Third, he would establish a foundation in his mother's name dedicated to government transparency and accountability. This would honor her legacy while providing a positive framework for discussing her work. And what about my role in the cover-up? Isabella asked. That will become public eventually, Edward said honestly. But it will be presented as part of a complicated family tragedy, not as a criminal conspiracy. I'll make it clear that you were protecting the family during a time of crisis. Isabella looked relieved but still worried. Are you sure this is the right approach? No, Edward admitted. But it's the approach that honors Mother's commitment to truth while also protecting the people I love. It's not perfect, but I think it's the best compromise possible. As they finished their dinner, Edward felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. He had found a way to honor his mother's legacy without destroying his family or his kingdom. It would be complicated and difficult, but it felt right. The funeral was held 3 days later, attended by heads of state from around the world. Edward delivered a eulogy that praised his father's service, while acknowledging that all leaders face difficult decisions and must sometimes learn from their mistakes. Isabella sat in the front row, dignified in her grief, but no longer carrying the terrible isolation of her secrets. After the funeral, Edward began the work of implementing his plan. Some government officials resigned when confronted with the evidence. Others initially resisted but eventually agreed to cooperate when faced with the prospect of public exposure. Slowly, justice was being served for the corruption his mother had died fighting. The truth about Queen Margaret's death would emerge gradually over the coming months. but it would be framed properly as the story of a principled woman who sacrificed everything for justice. Isabella's role would be understood as that of a loyal family member who made difficult choices during a tragedy. Edward's reign was beginning with the complicated task of healing old wounds while building a more transparent future. It wasn't the simple, glorious beginning he had once imagined, but it was honest and real, and perhaps that was exactly what the kingdom needed. 6 months after his father's death, King Edward stood once again in the blue drawing room, where he had first confronted Isabella with the letter. But now the room felt different, lighter somehow, as if the weight of secrets had been lifted from its walls. The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the roses in the garden that continued to bloom in memory of his mother. The gradual revelation of Queen Margaret's anti-corruption work had been carefully managed with the help of trusted journalists and government officials. The story that emerged painted her as a heroic figure who had sacrificed her life in pursuit of justice. The corrupt ministers she had been investigating had all resigned or been removed from office, and new transparency measures had been implemented throughout the government. Edward's marriage to Catherine had taken place 2 months earlier, in a ceremony that balanced tradition with the new openness he was trying to bring to the monarchy. Catherine had been told the complete truth about the family's history before their engagement was announced, and she had chosen to stand by Edward despite the complications. Their partnership was built on honesty from the beginning. Isabella's role in the events surrounding Queen Margaret's death had been revealed as Edward planned, presented in the context of a grieving family making difficult decisions during a tragedy. While there had been some criticism and calls for her to withdraw from public life, the majority of the public had shown understanding and compassion for her situation. She continued to live at the palace and maintain her charitable work, though she had stepped back from some of her more prominent royal duties. On this particular morning, Edward was expecting an important visitor. Dr. Margaret Thompson was an investigative journalist who had been working with him to document his mother's anti-corruption research. She had been instrumental in helping Edward tell the story in a way that honored Queen Margaret's legacy while being honest about the family's struggles. "Your Majesty," Dr. Thompson said as she entered the drawing room, "I have the final draft of the article about your mother's work. I think you'll be pleased with how it presents her legacy." Edward accepted the folder she offered and read through the article carefully. The piece portrayed Queen Margaret as a principled leader who had uncovered serious government corruption and died while working to expose it. It mentioned the strain this work had placed on her marriage and her family, but framed these challenges as evidence of her commitment to justice rather than personal failings. "This is excellent," Edward said. "It tells the truth without sensationalizing the personal details." "There's something else I wanted to discuss with you," Dr. Thompson said. "My research has uncovered additional evidence that some of the corrupt officials your mother was investigating had connections to organized crime. This goes far deeper than simple bribery and kickbacks." Edward felt his stomach tighten. What kind of connections? Money laundering primarily. Several of the companies that were paying bribes to government ministers were fronts for criminal organizations from Eastern Europe. Your mother had begun to uncover these connections when she died. Are you suggesting that her death might not have been accidental after all? Dr. Thompson hesitated. "I'm not suggesting anything definitive, but the timing is suspicious. Your mother was getting close to exposing a major criminal operation, and then she died in a car accident. It's possible that someone wanted to stop her investigation." Edward felt the ground shifting beneath him once again. Just when he thought he understood what had happened to his mother, new questions were emerging. "Do you have evidence of foul play?" "Not direct evidence, no, but I have financial records that show several suspicious transactions in the weeks before your mother's death. Money was moved through various accounts in ways that suggest someone was preparing for a major disruption to their operations. Have you shared this information with the police? I wanted to speak with you first. Reopening the investigation into your mother's death would be a major undertaking. It would mean questioning everyone who was involved that night, including your stepmother." Edward thought about Isabella, who had finally found some peace after months of public scrutiny. Reopening the investigation would put her back in the spotlight and force her to relive the trauma of that night. It would also raise new questions about why the original investigation had been so limited. "What would you need to pursue this further?" Edward asked. "Access to your mother's complete files, including any materials that weren't turned over to the police initially. I would also need to interview everyone who was close to your mother during her final months. Edward realized that this decision would affect not just his family, but potentially the entire kingdom. If Queen Margaret had been murdered by criminal organizations, it would be one of the biggest scandals in the country's history. It would also mean that those responsible had escaped justice for 15 years. "Give me some time to consider this," Edward said. "And please don't publish anything about these suspicions until we've had a chance to investigate properly." After Dr. Thompson left, Edward sat alone in the drawing room, trying to process this new information. He had worked so hard to find the truth about his mother's death and to honor her legacy. Now it seemed that there might be an even darker truth hidden beneath what he had already discovered. Edward decided he needed to speak with Isabella before making any decisions about reopening the investigation. She had been the only witness to the accident, and her testimony would be crucial to understanding what really happened that night. But he dreaded having to put her through more questioning and publicity. He found Isabella in the palace library, reading to a group of children who were visiting as part of a literacy program she had helped establish. She looked peaceful and content as she showed the children pictures in a storybook and helped them sound out difficult words. It reminded Edward of how she had helped him with his own reading when he was young. After the children left with their teachers, Edward approached Isabella. "Could we talk privately? There's something important I need to discuss with you." Isabella looked concerned but nodded. They walked to her private sitting room, a cozy space filled with photographs of the family and gifts from the many charities she supported. "What's troubling you?" Isabella asked as they sat down. Edward explained Dr. Thompson's research about the connections between the corrupt government ministers and organized crime. He told her about the suspicious financial transactions and the possibility that Queen Margaret's death might not have been accidental. Isabella listened in stunned silence. When Edward finished speaking, she was pale and shaking. "Are you saying that Margaret might have been murdered? I'm saying it's a possibility we need to investigate. You were there that night. Is there anything you didn't tell the police, anything that might be relevant now?" Isabella closed her eyes and was quiet for a long time. When she opened them, there were tears streaming down her face. "There was something," she said quietly. "What?" "When I was following Margaret's car that night, I noticed another vehicle behind me. It was keeping its distance, but it seemed to be following the same route we were taking. I thought it was just a coincidence at the time." Edward felt his heart racing. "What kind of vehicle?" "A dark sedan, maybe black or dark blue. I couldn't see the license plate clearly because it was raining and the car was staying far back." "Did you see the driver?" "No. It was too dark and too far away. After Margaret's accident, I was so focused on trying to help her that I forgot all about the other car. When the police arrived, I didn't think to mention it." "Did the other car stop at the accident scene?" Isabella shook her head. "I don't think so. I was so focused on Margaret that I wasn't paying attention to traffic. But when I think back on it now, I don't remember seeing that car again after the accident happened." Edward realized that this information could be crucial evidence. A car following both Queen Margaret and Isabella on the night of the accident was highly suspicious, especially given what Dr. Thompson had discovered about organized crime connections. "Isabella, I need to ask you something difficult. If we reopen the investigation into Mother's death, are you prepared to testify about what you saw that night?" Isabella nodded firmly. "If there's even a chance that Margaret was murdered, then yes, absolutely. I owe it to her memory to tell everything I know. It will mean more publicity, more scrutiny of our family. The press will dig into every detail of that night." "I understand. But Edward, if criminal organizations killed your mother to stop her anti-corruption work, then they need to be brought to justice. Margaret died fighting for what was right. The least I can do is help finish that fight." Edward felt a surge of respect for Isabella. Despite everything she had been through, she was willing to endure more scrutiny and pain if it meant finding justice for his mother. Over the next few weeks, Edward worked with Dr. Thompson and law enforcement officials to quietly reopen the investigation into Queen Margaret's death. The original accident report was reviewed, and new forensic techniques were applied to the evidence that had been preserved from the scene. The investigation revealed several troubling inconsistencies. The damage to Queen Margaret's car was consistent with losing control on a wet road, but there were also scratches and paint residue that suggested contact with another vehicle. These details had been overlooked or dismissed in the original investigation. More importantly, Financial records showed that large sums of money had been transferred out of the country in the days following Queen Margaret's death. Several of the companies under investigation had suddenly changed their business operations, as if they were trying to cover their tracks. The dark sedan Isabella had seen following them that night was traced through traffic cameras to a rental car agency. The car had been rented with false identification, but security footage from the rental agency showed a man with connections to known criminal organizations. As the evidence mounted, it became clear that Queen Margaret's death had indeed been murder, disguised as an accident. The criminal organizations she was investigating had decided to eliminate her rather than risk exposure of their operations. The revelation sent shockwaves through the kingdom and beyond. The idea that organized criminals had murdered a queen to protect their corrupt activities was almost too horrible to believe. But the evidence was overwhelming, and arrests were made both domestically and internationally. Isabella's testimony was crucial to the case. Her description of the car following them that night, combined with the forensic evidence and financial records, helped prosecutors build a strong case against the conspirators. She testified with dignity and courage, despite the intense media attention. Edward watched the trial proceedings with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice was finally being served for his mother's death, but it came 15 years too late. The men responsible had lived free, while his family had struggled with guilt and secrets. During the trial, even more details emerged about Queen Margaret's investigation. She had been closer than anyone realized to exposing a massive criminal network that extended throughout the government and beyond. Her death had not only ended her life, but had allowed criminal operations to continue for another 15 years. The trial concluded with convictions on multiple charges of murder, conspiracy, and corruption. Several high-profile figures were sentenced to life in prison, and millions of dollars in criminal proceeds were recovered and returned to the public treasury. For Edward, the conclusion of the trial brought a sense of closure, but also a renewed commitment to the principles his mother had died defending. He established new anti-corruption agencies, implemented stronger oversight of government operations, and created international partnerships to combat organized crime. Isabella was finally free from the burden of secrets and guilt she had carried for so long. The public now understood that she had been an innocent witness caught up in a criminal conspiracy, not someone who had benefited from wrongdoing. She was able to resume her full range of royal duties with restored dignity and respect. Edward's marriage to Catherine grew stronger as they worked together to reform the monarchy and make it more transparent and accountable to the people. They were building something new on the foundation of truth rather than the shifting sands of secrets and lies. As King Edward stood once again in his mother's rose garden on the anniversary of her death, he reflected on everything that had changed in the past year. The truth had been painful and complicated, but it had also been liberating. His mother's work was finally complete, and justice had been served. Queen Margaret's legacy lived on not just in the beautiful roses she had planted, but in the stronger, more honest institutions her son was building in her memory. The kingdom she had died trying to protect was finally becoming the place of justice and integrity she had envisioned. Edward knew that being king would continue to bring difficult decisions and moral challenges, but he faced the future with confidence, knowing that he had learned to value truth above convenience and justice above comfort. These were the principles his mother had died for, and they would guide his reign for years to come. The secrets were finally gone, replaced by the harder but more reliable foundation of truth. And in that truth, both Edward and his kingdom found the strength to build a better future.